On August 9, 1974, Richard Milhous Nixon became the first president in the history of the United States to resign from office. His staff gathered in the White House to bid him farewell, as millions of Americans watched on television, some in sorrow and disbelief, others glad to see him go. Richard Nixon had accomplished great things as president and had been re-elected overwhelmingly, but he was also widely distrusted, sometimes ridiculed, even despised.
You were here to say goodbye to us, and we don't have a good word for it in English. The best is au revoir. We'll see you again.
Richard Nixon was studiedly different to different people. And I don't think there's any one person, including his wife probably, who could sit down and write the definitive explanation of Richard Nixon. We all saw him differently.
He was a tireless campaigner, a survivor of more than a quarter of a century of political battle, yet so self-conscious that he disliked shaking hands and found it hard to look anyone in the eye.
And I intend to continue to expose the people that have sold this country down the river until we have driven all the crooks and the communists and those that defend them out of our country.
He rose to power as a crusader against communism, only to make his most lasting mark building bridges to China and the Soviet Union. He had millions of admirers all over the world, but trusted almost no one, and in the end was left to face his enemies alone. The advice he offered his staff in his last speech as president stirred the thick August air with admonitions that seemed to apply most aptly to Nixon himself.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
It struck me from time to time that Nixon as a character would have been so easy to fix, in the sense of removing these rather petty flaws. And yet, I think it's also true that if you did this, you would probably have removed that very inner core of insecurity that led to his drive. A secure Nixon, almost surely in my view, would never have been president of the United States at all.
Richard Nixon was born in the tiny Southern California desert town of Yorba Linda in 1913. He grew up among the people he would one day call forgotten Americans and the silent majority. Hard-working, church-going people. Farmers, shopkeepers, people with an inbred respect for authority and an unyielding belief in the American dream.
I remember my old man. I think that they would have called him sort of a little man, common man. He didn't consider himself that way. You know what he was? He was a streetcar motorman first, and then he was a farmer, and then he had a lemon ranch, and then he was a grocer. But he was a great man.
Richard had his father's fire, his mother, Hannah Milhouse Nixon, once said, and my tact. She seemed the opposite of the loud, aggressive husband her Quaker family always believed beneath her. Soft-spoken, tightly controlled, never allowing anger to get the better of her. She insisted her second son be called Richard, not Dick, taught him to read before he entered school, and made sure he said his prayers daily and went 4 times to Quaker meeting on Sundays.
I taught Richard Nixon in the 2nd grade here in Yorba Linda. He sat in the back seat and always came to school with a white starched shirt with long sleeves. He was always a quiet, dignified little fellow and a very good student.
He was clumsy but dogged at games, shy but gifted at reciting poetry, and full of his father's enthusiasm for politics.
Dick was politically inclined as a kid. I remember walking to school, and I think it was when Harding was running for president, and old Dick was there on a stump saying why everybody should vote for Harding.
The Nixons moved to nearby Whittier when Richard was 9. Founded by Quakers in 1887, it was a sober, industrious community. No liquor stores, no bars, no dance halls. Frank Nixon bought a gas station along the highway and soon added a general store where the whole family worked, often 16 hours a day, 7 days a week.
One thing my mother and dad always used to say when we were growing up, I don't mean my mother because she was a little biased, but my dad used to say when we were growing up, he said, you know, you boys, speaking to me particularly, said, you boys have got to get out and scratch. You're not going to get anywhere in your good looks.
When Richard was 12, his younger brother Arthur suddenly fell ill and died. And within 8 years, Harold, the eldest brother and family favorite, would succumb to tuberculosis. Hannah Nixon recalled, it was Arthur's passing that first stirred within Richard a determination to help make up for our loss by making us very proud of him. He may have felt a kind of guilt that Harold and Arthur were dead and he was alive, she remembered.
My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others, and seeing each of them die. And when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her, but she was a saint.
I would like to study law and enter politics for an occupation, Nixon wrote in the 8th grade, so that I might be of some good to the people. Nixon worked hard for everything he got, and his sober, industrious air sometimes put off his contemporaries. When he ran for class president at Whittier High, he lost to a candidate he later dismissed as an athlete and personality boy. He would not lose another election for 30 years. Both Harvard and Yale invited Nixon to apply for scholarships, but his dream of a prestigious Eastern university was frustrated. It was 1930, the Great Depression, and Harold was in the midst of his long struggle with tuberculosis. We needed Richard at home, Hannah Nixon remembered. Nixon had to settle for Whittier College, just down the road, and later said he'd never felt disappointed. He soon became a big man on the small campus. He was an ambitious student politician, an accomplished actor, a champion debater. The Whittier student body elected Nixon president in 1933. He was both admired and resented for what one student called an almost ruthless cocksureness. The exclusive Franklin Club denied Nixon membership. He helped organize a competing club, the Orthogonians, or square shooters, students who took pride in working their way through college. They wore no ties, served spaghetti and beans, and attracted the college's best athletes. Nixon later denied there was any class distinction between his shirt-sleeved Orthogonians and the tuxedoed Franklins. But throughout his life, he would emphasize the differences between his own modest beginnings and the wealthy, privileged backgrounds of his political opponents. Duke Law School was Nixon's next training ground in persistence, success, and frustration. His classmates called him Gloomy Gus. He lived frugally, studied endlessly, and never walked away from a classroom confrontation.
We had a professor of torts, Douglas Maggs, who was so intimidating that most people backed down. The first person in our class that I remember that stood up to him and kind of barked back was Nixon. And he's standing there kind of flat-footed, and you could just see he was dug in. And he was just standing up to Maggs, kind of almost shaking in his shoes, but by gosh, he wasn't going to back down.
Nixon graduated third in his class, hoping for a job with an East Coast law firm or the FBI. But his applications were rejected. He went back home to Whittier. Nixon's mother helped him get a job in a friend's law office. But small-town law bored him, and he was still too young and inexperienced for state politics. Then, while auditioning for a local play, he fell in love. Pat Ryan was a truck farmer's red-haired daughter, 10 months older than he and even more accustomed to hard work and hardship. She had worked her way through college as a switchboard operator, sales girl, and movie extra before taking a teaching job at Whittier High. Don't laugh, Nixon told her, even before their first date, but someday, I'm going to marry you. He pursued Pat for over 2 years, even driving her to Los Angeles on weekends when she had dates with other men, then waiting around to take her home again. He married her in June of 1940, but his political ambitions would have to wait 5 more years. The world was at war. 8 months after Pearl Harbor, Nixon joined the Navy, and as a lieutenant commander was sent to the Solomon Islands. He was best remembered for his skill at scrounging food and liquor and supplies for the grateful men who called him Nick. And he learned to play poker, not just to fill the time, but to make some extra money.
He said to me, "Do you think that there's any sure way to win?" And I said, "Well, if you don't think you have the best hand going in, get out, drop. Don't ante up." I said, "The trouble with that is that you'll probably drop 3 or 4 hands out of 5, and it's very boring, and I haven't got the patience to do it." Well, to our intense surprise, he did exactly that. And he won quite more frequently than he lost, and he sent home to California a fair amount of money. I have no idea exactly how much, but my estimate was between $6,000 and $7,000.
It was his poker winnings that helped finance Nixon's first political campaign. At war's end, he was approached by a group of Republican bankers and businessmen from Whittier who sought a candidate to unseat the 5-term Democratic Congressman Jerry Voorhees. Voorhees, a Yale graduate from a wealthy family, was anathema to Whittier Republicans. He supported labor, opposed big oil and big banking, and championed the social welfare programs of the New Deal. Lieutenant Commander Nixon jumped at the opportunity to run against him. Leading Republicans around Whittier were confident they finally had found the man to defeat Jerry Voorhees. Nixon comes from good Quaker stock, a local banker wrote. He is a very aggressive individual. Another partisan said, "This man is saleable merchandise." In his first campaign, Nixon developed an approach that remained remarkably consistent through nearly 3 decades. The candidate presented himself as a family man from a long tradition of work and service, a firm believer in individual initiative, a champion of the forgotten man. And at the same time, he proved to be a fierce, no-holds-barred combatant, accusing Voorhees of ties to communist organizations, distorting Voorhees's record in Congress.
Just before the election, a good many people came and told me, "Do you know about the telephone calls that are being made?" And I said, "No, I didn't." Well, they said, I was called on the phone by an unidentified person who simply said, "Do you know that Jerry Voorhees is a communist? And you should vote for Mr. Nixon because of this fact."
The character of Nixon's campaign surprised many of his friends. "Of course I knew Jerry Voorhees wasn't a communist," he later told a Voorhees aide. "But I had to win. That's the thing you don't understand. The important thing is to win."
All the stops were pulled, and Mr. Nixon beat me. He was a good debater. He was a clever debater. I wouldn't deny that at all. But I still feel that there were a good many below-the-belt blows struck in the campaign.
Nixon was swept into office with 60% of the vote, part of a nationwide Republican surge. His boyhood goal, to enter politics, had been achieved.
Capitol Hill in Washington is again the nation's focal point as the 80th Congress convenes during one of the most crucial periods in the nation's history. The Republican-controlled Congress takes the helm in the House. Halleck of Indiana.
As the Nixons posed beneath the cherry blossoms with baby Tricia, it was a heady time for a young Republican. The GOP controlled both houses of Congress for the first time in 20 years, and the fervent anti-communism that had helped Nixon win the election was well suited to the times.
Soviet Russia was expansively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war. Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
I'm not now a communist.
And in the United States, the House Committee on Un-American Activities searched for Soviet sympathizers. Congressman Nixon soon became the junior member of that controversial headline-making body. And on August 3rd, 1948, shortly after the birth of Nixon's second daughter, Julie, an unlikely drama began that would make the issue of communist subversion front-page news and make Congressman Nixon a national figure almost overnight.
Where the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, to help you God.
A strange, self-confessed ex-communist and editor of Time magazine named Whittaker Chambers appeared before the committee to make a sensational charge. Alger Hiss, protege of Oliver Wendell Holmes, aide to Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta, and one of the organizers of the United Nations, was, said Chambers, a communist, intent upon infiltrating the highest offices of government.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting.
My contacts with any foreign representative who could possibly have been a communist have been strictly official. To the best of my knowledge...
Most observers found Hiss persuasive, but Nixon had learned through Father John Cronin, a Catholic priest with FBI connections, that Hiss had been under suspicion for years. Nixon insisted the hearings continue.
Who's the Liar? Might well be the title of the drama, which unfolds before a packed caucus room where the House Un-American Affairs Committee members swear in Alger Hiss.
The hearings were high drama. Rumors spread that Chambers was a psychopath. Hiss claimed never to have known him. President Truman denounced the proceedings as politically motivated and ordered government agencies to refuse to cooperate. Nixon charged that the Democrats were mounting a cover-up. The freshman congressman from Whittier had put himself in the center of it all.
Nixon realized that once he had committed himself, that if everything collapsed, if Hiss was exonerated, or if the charges were not proved to the hilt, he would be badly hurt. Now, I don't think he would have been permanently hurt, but certainly I think if that had happened, Richard Nixon would never have become a senator and never would have become president of the United States.
He immersed himself in the case with an absorption that was almost frightening, Pat Nixon remembered. When others were ready to drop the case, Nixon and Chief Investigator Robert Stripling talked them out of it. They were sure Hiss was lying when he claimed not even to have known Chambers, and they set out to prove it.
We went up and got Mr. Chambers, put him in the grand jury room. We put him under oath, and we said, in effect, you claim you know Mr. Hiss? Tell us all about him. What did he call his wife? What did she call him? Did they have a dog? Did they have a veterinarian? Did they have a doctor? Did they have a cook? Give us the housekeeping details, beginning at the front door. And he rattled on for 2 hours. It was very obvious that he indeed did know Mr. Hiss, and quite well.
There was also another factor which I think is very important, and that was a kind of personal animus. Hiss was arrogant on the stand, and he rubbed Nixon the wrong way, and he snapped at Nixon a couple of times, and so on. And it became, I think, also a personal thing for Nixon. He saw that it could be a big issue, and his whole temperament made him want to pursue it.
I believe that I was first introduced to Mr. Hiss by Harold Ware and J. Peters.
Chambers, now fighting a libel suit, leveled a still more sensational charge, one he had not yet shared with the committee. He claimed that Hiss had actually been a spy before the war, copying secret State Department documents which Chambers himself had passed on to a Soviet contact. Nixon was furious that Chambers had been holding out on him. He ordered any evidence Chambers might have subpoenaed, then left with his wife on a long-delayed Caribbean vacation.
In the latest sensational turn of the Red Espionage probe, the Maryland farm of the magazine editor becomes the focus of attention.
From a hollowed-out pumpkin, Chambers produced apparent proof of espionage, microfilm of stolen documents. Nixon made the nation's front pages when he was plucked from mid-ocean and flown back to Washington for a press conference.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents...
The microfilm, thereafter known as the Pumpkin Papers, provided the evidence and the publicity Nixon needed. Finally, after 2 controversial trials, Hiss was found guilty of perjury and imprisoned. The Hiss case polarized American opinion about Richard Nixon. To conservatives, he had fearlessly rooted out a dangerous subversive. But in the eyes of many liberals, Nixon had destroyed an honorable man and set the stage for more unscrupulous communist hunters. But there was no doubt that at the age of 35, the congressman from Whittier had become a national figure. In 1950, the Russians had exploded an atomic bomb of their own. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were charged with giving the Soviets atomic secrets. Communists took control of mainland China. In Korea, communist troops poured across the 38th parallel, and American soldiers were sent to stop them. Senator Joseph McCarthy charged that communists in government were responsible for it all.
Call the roll, and call the roll of the traitors and plunderers.
And Congressman Nixon had his sights on the Senate. His opponent was 3-term Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas. Like Jerry Voorhees, she was wealthy, well-educated, and an outspoken New Dealer. She condemned the fear of internal communism as irrational and opposed the very existence of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Politicians in both parties called the former actress a bleeding heart liberal, a do-gooder, a Hollywood parlor pink. Congressman John F. Kennedy quietly gave Nixon $1,000 to help defeat her, saying, "It won't break my heart if you can turn the Senate's loss into Hollywood's gain." Mrs. Douglas was a perfect target for what Nixon called his rocking-socking style of campaigning. Implying the Congresswoman was pro-communist, he distributed a flyer on pink paper showing Mrs. Douglas had voted with the controversial left-wing Congressman Vito Marcantonio 354 times. The fact that most Democrats and a good many Republicans had voted the same way was ignored. Nixon charged that his opponent was pink right down to her underwear. Mrs. Douglas fought back hard, calling Nixon a peewee who was trying to scare people into voting for him. And she gave him the nickname he would never entirely shake, Tricky Dick.
When Richard Nixon ran for the House of Representatives and unseated Jerry Boris, it was the same kind of campaign as he waged against me in 1950. But the essence of that kind of campaign is this: to avoid the issues, you work up bogus issues, trying to play on the fears of people. Because if you talk about the real issues, you may lose votes. It's as simple as that.
Other candidates employed scare tactics that year, but few were more blatant than Richard Nixon's. People react to fear, he once told an aide, not love. They don't teach that in Sunday school, but it's true. Nixon defeated Mrs. Douglas by almost 700,000 votes, the largest plurality won by any senatorial candidate in the country.
A lot of people probably wonder how it is possible for a candidate to be elected into any office in California when he is a member of the Republican Party. I have just had that experience, and I should like to point out the reason for our election victory. It's because in this particular election, the issues, rather than the partisan labels of the candidates, were what governed the electorate. I think the major issue...
Richard Nixon does not simply defeat Jerry Voorhees for the Congress or defeat Helen Gahagan Douglas for the Senate in 1950. He destroys these people politically and very nearly personally. And he does that in such a way as to leave a great legacy of bitterness among their supporters and even among onlookers, people who are sort of neutral observers on the side.
Chicago is a city divided as thousands of delegates and observers stream into the city for the 25th Republican Convention. Partisanship runs high, and the trappings of the Grand Old Party dominate the scene before the serious business gets underway. Both Eisenhower and Taft...
After only a year and a half in the Senate, Nixon was a leading candidate for the vice presidential nomination.
And here comes Mr. Republican himself, Senator Robert Taft.
Taft partisans, mostly conservative and isolationist, applauded Nixon's fervent anti-communism, while General Eisenhower's more liberal internationalist backers were attracted to Nixon's support of the Marshall Plan, his commitment to rebuilding post-war Europe. The California delegation was pledged to its favorite son, Governor Earl Warren, but behind the scenes, Nixon lobbied hard for the nomination of Eisenhower.
He was a man with no set ideology, no set real deep-down principles. He wasn't a Taft Republican. He wasn't an Eisenhower Republican. He was a Nixon Republican.
With New York's big block of votes, the issue is no longer in doubt. And a wildly cheering convention hails its nominee, Dwight D. Eisenhower, soldier and statesman.
Away from the convention floor, Eisenhower huddled with Nixon. The young senator represented the growing power of the West Coast, and he was a rough-and-tumble campaigner. The general offered him the vice presidency.
And as we contribute to the Republican cause, what we will do is to forge a great victory for the Republican Party next November. But a victory which will be a victory not only for the Republican Party, But what is more important, it will be a victory for America and for the cause of free peoples throughout the world.
Eisenhower intended to keep to the high road, he told his new running mate. It was up to Nixon to flail the Democrats and their presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson.
There is no question in my mind as to the loyalty of Mr. Stevenson. But the question is one as to his judgment.
Many good Americans are concerned by the way that President Truman and Governor Stevenson have both attempted to ridicule and poo-poo the communist threat within the United States.
You read about another bribe, you read about another tax fix, you read about another gangster getting favors from the government. The people are sick and tired of it. They're outraged and they want something done about it, and they're tired of an administration which, instead of cleaning up, is covering up the scandals in Washington at the present time.
Suddenly, Nixon faced a scandal of his own. The New York Post reported that wealthy supporters had set up a secret fund for Nixon's personal use.
And if that were true, let me say, first of all, that I should never have accepted the nomination for the Vice Presidency of the United States, and if it were true, I would get off the ticket right away. But it is not true.
In fact, the fund was not secret and was earmarked exclusively for political expenses. But the damage had been done. Aides urged Eisenhower to drop Nixon from the ticket. Even Republican newspapers demanded he resign.
When those headlines first came in the paper, I just wanted to hide that paper. I didn't want anyone to see it. I couldn't eat, and I knew that it wasn't true, but what could I do?
Well, when the world seemed the blackest and the whole Nixon campaign had halted in Portland, Oregon, I got a telegram from his mother. I took it into him and gave it to him, and he was sitting in a large chair with his arms on the side, almost like the Lincoln statue that you see in Washington, the Lincoln Memorial. And I handed him the telegram, and he read it, and he dropped it on his in the chair, and his head fell forward, and tears came down his eyes, and it was obvious that he'd been terribly moved by what all this meant. That it was so important to him to prove to his mother that he had never done anything wrong.
Was Nixon on or off the ticket? General Eisenhower had been frustratingly silent. Finally, after 3 days of waiting, a weary, anxious Nixon received Eisenhower's phone call.
He said, General, he said, I'm just Richard Nixon. And he said, I'm just a very young guy that doesn't know you very well. But he said, I must tell you, General, that there comes a time, even in your life, when you have to or get off the pot.
And there was this dead silence, and we didn't know whether the ball game was over right then or not. But Eisenhower seemed to take it in as it was meant to be given, and came to the conclusion, as he told Nixon on the phone, he reported to us after the conversation, that Nixon should go to California and make a nationwide speech explaining all the details of this so-called secret fund, and that he would authorize the National Committee to pay for the cost.
Nixon secluded himself in Los Angeles and prepared to use the young medium of television as it had never been used before. He would bypass the press, bypass even Eisenhower, and plead his case directly to the American people. This primetime broadcast would come to be known as the Checkers speech and widen the gap between Nixon's admirers and his detractors. To some, he seemed humble, honest, sincere. To others, self-righteous and shamelessly manipulative.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency, and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. And so now what I am going to do, and incidentally, this is unprecedented in the history of American politics. I am going at this time to give to this television and radio audience a complete financial history. Everything I've earned, everything I've spent, everything I owe.
I don't remember talking to his mother, but his father, he thought that he really did all right. He said, I hated to hear him say some of the things he said, but he told the truth, and that's what the people wanted to hear, and that's did the job for him.
First of all, we've got a house in Washington which cost $41,000 and in which we owe $20,000. We have a house in Whittier, California, which cost $13,000 and on which we owe $3,000. My folks are living there at the present time.
His wife asked him, "Why do you have to tell people how little we have and how much we owe?" "People in political life have to live in a goldfish bowl," he answered. But I knew it was a weak explanation for the humiliation I was asking her to endure.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat. But she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything.
The cloth coat remark was aimed at the Truman administration, then plagued by mink coat bribery charges. Next, Nixon borrowed a technique from Franklin Roosevelt. He talked about his dog. Using the same ploy as FDR, he wrote in his memoirs, would irritate my opponents and delight my friends.
We did get something, a gift, after the election. It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog, black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
I would do nothing that would harm the possibilities of Dwight Eisenhower to become president of the United States. And for that reason, I am submitted to the Republican National Committee tonight through this television broadcast, the decision which it is theirs to make.
Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off. And whatever their decision is, I will abide by it.
I have been a warrior, and I like courage. And tonight I saw an example of courage.
All those in favor of Nixon continuing as a candidate will say aye.
I had called some Republican friends of mine and had asked them to send telegrams to Nixon saying, "Don't drop off the ticket," and they had refused. And I was with some of them when I watched the Checkers speech, and afterwards every one of them sent a telegram to Nixon saying, "Great job, stay on the ticket."
Nixon stayed on the ticket that was swept into office in November, the first Republican administration in 2 decades.
During the Eisenhower years, Nixon became the point man. Eisenhower never expected to have to get into too much political discussion, but that was one of the reasons he put young Senator Richard Nixon on the ticket, because he could do that. So all the tough political assignments usually were given to Nixon.
All a Democrat Congress offers, if elected this year, is a return to the policies of the Truman administration.
He's a very partisan creature, after all, and he becomes, for the first time, really the focus of genuine criticism in the press. He has enjoyed enormous immunity in the press in Southern California and nationally up until the '52 campaign, and he suffers his first tarnish in the Fund episode, and that gets worse and worse until Herb Bloch begins to give him a heavy beard in cartoons in the Washington Post, and he comes under sometimes vicious, often very telling and accurate attack in the national media.
A stunned nation hears that its president is stricken with a heart attack at the...
Nixon's detractors held their breath during Eisenhower's illness in September 1955. But the vice president surprised even his most severe critics. For nearly 2 months, Nixon was a cautious substitute president, standing in for Eisenhower while not calling attention to himself.
The American people can be assured that the business of government will go ahead as usual despite the president's illness. Under the president's leadership, a team has been developed in Washington which will carry out the very well-defined foreign policies and domestic policies that the president himself has laid down during his first 2.5 years in office.
Fully recovered, Eisenhower announced he would seek re-election, but did not guarantee Nixon a place on the ticket. Privately, he thought him immature, a political liability. But Nixon refused to consider the president's offer of a cabinet position instead of the vice presidency. He finally forced Eisenhower's hand.
I met with the president this afternoon in the White House, and at that time I informed him that in the event that he and the delegates to the Republican National Convention decided that it was in the best interests of the Republican Party and his administration for me to continue in my present office, that I would be honored to accept renomination as the Republican candidate for Vice President.
Well, the President has asked me to say that he was delighted to hear of the Vice President's decision.
No man could be more highly honored than to be selected as the running mate of such a great president. I accept this nomination in that spirit.
Nixon was less aggressive in 1956 than in earlier campaigns. The press began to write of a new Nixon, but the vice president remained the Democrats' favorite target.
I must say bluntly that every piece of scientific evidence we have, every lesson of history and experience, indicates that a Republican victory tomorrow would mean that Richard Nixon would probably be president of this country within the next 4 years. I say frankly, as a citizen, more than a candidate, that I recoil at the prospect of Mr. Nixon as custodian of this nation's future, as guardian of the hydrogen bomb, as representative of America in the world, as commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces.
As evening returns come in, the trend is unmistakable. It's Eisenhower by a landslide with 457 electoral votes to 74 for Stevenson, and a 9 million vote plurality.
I, Richard M. Nixon, do solemnly swear that I
Nixon was a survivor. He had overcome Eisenhower's indifference, a sometimes hostile press, and bitter partisan attacks. He entered his second vice presidential term as the Republican heir apparent. Richard Nixon was the favorite to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1960. Events of the last 4 years had made him one of the most visible vice presidents in history. During a tour of South America, he had faced down angry leftist mobs that spat upon him and his wife and attacked their motorcade. Maintaining his composure throughout the ordeal, Nixon returned home to a hero's welcome. And in Moscow, he had confronted the leader of the communist world, Nikita Khrushchev, in an impromptu televised debate.
There must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything.
Nixon's combination of toughness and humor played well back home. In July 1960, Republicans embraced him as their presidential candidate.
Declares, therefore, that Vice President Richard M. Nixon has been unanimously nominated to be the candidate of the Republican Party for the office of President of the United States.
Just 14 years after he was tapped by a group of small-town businessmen to run for Congress in California, Richard Nixon stood at the top of his party. As he mapped out an ambitious 50-state campaign, he was challenged by his opponent, John F. Kennedy, to a series of televised debates, the first in American history. Even when hospitalized for 2 weeks with a knee injury, Nixon remained confident, anxious for the debates to begin, eager once again to use television to talk directly to the voters.
At the time, there was a feeling that this overall might be a mismatch. Nixon was the candidate who had more prominence, who had been a member of the House, a member of the Senate, and the Vice President of the United States. Kennedy, he didn't have a particularly strong reputation in Congress. There was some feeling that he was, to some extent, a playboy, but he wasn't too serious a senator. So I think people felt that Nixon had the edge, and I think Nixon felt that he had the edge.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. According to rules set by the candidates themselves, each man...
The Nixon-Kennedy debates would forever change the way Americans chose their presidents. Political rallies and old-fashioned handshaking became much less important than the image on the television screen.
You must understand that Nixon himself had said, I don't want any makeup on for these particular debates. What I tried to explain to Dick was he has a certain characteristics of his skin where it's almost transparent. And it was a very nice thought to say, you know, I don't want any makeup, but that he really needed it in order to have what we would call even an acceptable television picture. And of course, JFK, here he'd been riding in motorcades all over California with the top down. He looked like a bronze warrior when he came into Chicago. He really did.
Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged.
I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to see people who are unemployed. I know Senator Kennedy feels as deeply about these problems as I do. But our disagreement is not about the goals for America, but only about the means to reach those goals.
The first debate was costly to Nixon. The radio audience thought he had won, but the largest television audience in history had seen the vice president haggard and drawn, and had been given its first sustained look at the Kennedy style.
Kennedy had a great charm for not only the voters, but also for the press. The press corps had sort of a love affair with Jack Kennedy, and no matter what things we might do to make things better, we could serve a hot meal, they would serve a cold meal, and the press would like the cold better. And so that he felt he was running up against impossible odds.
And I say we can't afford to have the White House as a training ground for an inexperienced man who is rash and impulsive.
This administration has failed to recognize that in these changing times, with a revolution of rising expectations sweeping the globe, the United States has lost its image as a new, strong, vital, revolutionary society.
I have been to Russia and I've seen it. I've been to the United States and I've seen it. And there is no need for a second-rate psychology on the part of any American.
Mr. Vice President, what did you think of your reception today? Well, of course, it was the greatest of the campaign, and I think this means that we're on the way to victory in New York.
How about you? You agree? Oh, it was wonderful.
Election night, Nixon remembered, was the longest night of his life. It appeared at first to be a Kennedy sweep, then became too close to call, then edged back toward Kennedy again.
Please, just a minute. And as I look at the board here, while there are still some results still to come in, if the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States.
In the end, it proved to be one of the closest elections in history. Kennedy won by only 100,000 votes, and charges of Democratic fraud were widespread. Much of the winning margin came from Lyndon Johnson's Texas and Richard J. Daley's Chicago, but Nixon refused to demand a recount. If it failed to change the results, he wrote, charges of sore loser would follow me through history and remove any possibility of a further political career.
Richard Nixon is forever embittered by the experience and taken with the example. I think feels that never again will he be caught short, never again will his opponents outdo him, and never again will he trust the ordinary, normal, and honest devices of American politics to function as they're supposed to.
In his last official act as vice president, Nixon presided over a joint session of Congress on January 6, 1961, and announced his own defeat.
I now declare that John F. Kennedy has been elected President of the United States and Lyndon Johnson Vice President of the United States.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God.
Well, he handled it surprisingly well. In fact, he cheered us up a good deal of the time. He was still a very young man. I'm sure he had thoughts of the future. Biggest problem was that the fellow who defeated him was a young man, and all of us thought that meant at least 8 years for Jack Kennedy, and what is Nixon going to do for 8 years?
California, here I come, right back where I started from.
I shall not be a candidate for President of the United States in 1964. I shall be a candidate for Governor of the state of California in 1962.
But Nixon had been out of touch with his home state for too long. The campaign against incumbent Governor Pat Brown was bitter and exhausting. Nixon was soundly defeated. Reporters in Los Angeles were told the losing candidate had left and would not make a statement. But Nixon, his anger toward the press building for years, resolved to have the last word.
For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, you've had a lot of fun. A lot of fun. You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken. I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference, and I hope that what I have said today will at least make television, radio, the press recognize that they have a right and a responsibility. If they're against a candidate, give him the shaft. But also recognize if they give him the shaft, put one lonely reporter on the campaign who will report what the candidate says now and then. Thank you, gentlemen, and good day.
An angry, resentful Richard Nixon strode from the Beverly Hilton on November 7th, 1962, seemingly bound for political oblivion. Barring a miracle, said Time magazine, Richard Nixon's political career was over.